Thank you for joining us today on Earthfile. Welcome to the program. I'm Ayola Kasim. In many countries, the socio-economic effect of the pandemic, particularly loss of earnings and remittances, are heightening existing threats linked to conflict and climate change. The number of acutely hungry people in the world could increase by more than 100 million this year. That's according to the World Food Programme estimate. For particularly fragile countries, a slide towards famine is a real risk. The United Nations raised more than $1.7 billion in pledges recently to fund aid efforts in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger for the rest of 2020 and 2021. It also warned that a preventable tragedy is looming in the central Sahel region. We'll start today's program with a look at what is happening in the region. Do stay with us. At the Gao Pediatric Hospital in northern Mali, children suffering from malnutrition continue to receive treatment. Dihara Hame's son is admitted at the hospital. He's one of 5 million children, which make up some 13 million people who need emergency humanitarian assistance to survive. The World Food Programme says more than 7 million people had been pushed into acute hunger.
I brought my son to Gao Hospital because he was seriously ill. He even passed out. I thought he was going to die.
Often there are problems in getting therapeutic milk, which is something that is highly recommended in the management of severely malnourished children. Therefore, in absence of humanitarian aid, we wouldn't know how to take care of these children.
The pledges from 22 countries, the European Union, and the Education Cannot Wait Fund fell short of the $2.4 billion the United Nations said it needed. More than 13 million people in the region need humanitarian assistance. Some 1.5 million people are internally displaced. Lockdowns and other COVID-19 restriction measures have pushed an additional 6 million people into extreme poverty. Over 300 Fulani families are now sheltering at an informal site in Bagude, about 8 kilometers from Gao, after having fled their homes in Tessit.
A total of 5 people in my family have been killed during this conflict, including my brother's son.
In Gao, other families now live at a cultural center under very difficult circumstances. United Nations Aid Chief Mark Lowcock cited chronic poverty and underdevelopment, demographic growth and climate change, intercommunal clash, violent criminal gangs and extremists as some of the causes of the humanitarian crisis. The funds will help some 10 million people for the remainder of this year and through 2021 with nutrition and food, health services, water and sanitation, shelter, education, protection, and support to survivors of gender-based violence. France, a former colonial power in the region, is leading a coalition of West African and European allies to fight Islamist militants in the Sahel. It has deployed thousands of troops in the region south of the Sahara Desert since 2013, but militant violence has been on the rise. Parts of Mali, Niger and Burkina Faso are areas where the World Food Programme has warned could be hit by catastrophic levels of hunger unless humanitarian access is urgently granted to the organization. In a little more than a year, an insurgency has displaced more than 1 million people in Burkina Faso. Communities in the far north of the country are isolated from crucially needed humanitarian aid. Severe hunger has increased dramatically. Around 11,000 people are suffering from famine in the far northern areas of the country. Violence and insecurity have pushed 7.4 million people in the central Sahel region of West Africa into acute hunger. The number of internally displaced people has risen from 70,000 2 years ago to nearly 1.6 million today, including over 288,000 in Mali, more than 265,000 in Niger, and over 1 million in Burkina Faso. which is now home to the world's fastest growing displacement crisis. The most recent official data indicates that 4.3 million people are currently critically food insecure in Borno, Adamawa and Yobe states. And the number could reach up to 5.1 million over the lean season between June and August 2021. On Saturday, the 20th of November 2020, non-state armed group operatives killed tens of civilian farmers harvesting rice farms in Zabamari community, some 15 kilometers outside Maiduguri, Borno State's capital, sparking outrage across the country and internationally.
It is very clear to us that the only solution to this crisis is peace. We should always prioritize prevention in whatever we are doing, development where feasible, and humanitarian assistance where needed.
Today, rural communities fear for their lives and that of their children. They have not yet gone back to the farms and dread the harvest is entirely lost. Across the Sahel, World Food Programme helps millions of people displaced by insurgency and struggling local communities dig half-moons to feed their families and livestock. Half-moons retain water, allowing farmers to grow food and fodder in the desert here in the border area where Niger, Burkina Faso and Mali meet.
I believe there are about 11,000 people now in phase 5 famine condition, and we don't have access to it. If we can get to them, we can not only save their lives, but we can also change their lives. If we can just get them here, then we can work with them to grow crops, and then they won't have to be dependent on outside help.
The ability of humanitarian organizations to deliver assistance to those most in need has been jeopardized by worsening conflict and insecurity. Meanwhile, aid workers are also increasingly targeted by non-state armed groups in Burkina Faso, Mali and Niger. This means that needy communities are unable to access life-saving humanitarian assistance on which they so desperately depend in times of crisis.
Just a year ago, there were 200,000 people displaced because of terrorist and extremist groups. Now it's over 1 million. These were people in an area that were already struggling in so many ways because of flash floods and droughts, and you can look at the land, it's a tough piece of land. And so we're working with these internally displaced people to rehabilitate the landscape so that they can not be a burden on the local community, the host, and at the same time produce more food and take care of their families and sell in the marketplace.
The World Food Programme, the 2020 Nobel Peace Prize laureate, is urging governments to find ways for organizations to engage with communities and all actors on the ground, opening up safe passageways for humanitarian assistance to reach those in need. World Food Programme has continued to ramp up life-saving assistance in response to the deepening crisis and growing needs, assisting over 3.4 million people in August alone. The United Nations agency has scaled up to meet the growing needs in Burkina Faso. In the Horn of Africa, below average rainfall in 2018 and 2019 led to the worst cereal harvest in Somalia since records began in 1995, and to crop failures in neighboring Kenya. Floods followed. Somalia, Kenya, Ethiopia and Tanzania recorded at least double their average seasonal rainfall in late 2019. The rain helped crops grow but also felled the locusts that have devoured hundreds of thousands of hectares of land in those countries since January. For now, the poorest are most affected. Africa's overall gross domestic product will fall by between 2.25% and 12.12% as temperatures rise. Warmer and wetter weather is also more suitable for insects that transmit dengue fever, malaria and yellow fever. And worse is said to be ahead for the region's food supplies, economy and health. Temperatures have been rising on the continent of 1.2 billion at a comparable rate to other regions.
And without food security, you've got instability and you've got trouble. We know right now, because of COVID and climate extremes and conflict, man-made conflict, we're facing now 270 million people on the brink of starvation. We need to act, and we need to act right now.
But Africa is exceptionally vulnerable to the shock, according to the World Meteorological Organization. Warming temperatures are slashing crop yields. Agriculture is the backbone of Africa's economy. It's projected a reduction in yields of 13% in West and Central Africa, 11% in North Africa, and 8% in East and Southern Africa. African countries are generally low income and ill-equipped to respond to this and other consequences of climate change.
We also expect impacts in terms of disease and pests, but importantly we will have impacts generated by flooding on the infrastructure system for agriculture production, which is the main source of livelihoods and food security in the continent. So all indicates that the continuing warming would probably worsen the current 45.6% increase in terms of undernourished people we've seen from 2012.
But many are finding solutions. A Kenyan insect rearing farm started 2 years ago is using larvae to consume 20 to 30 tons a day of fruit waste collected from factories and markets in the capital Nairobi, and expects this to triple by the year's end. Insectipro, in turn, processes the black soldier fly larvae into animal feed and the rest of the waste into manure at its farm, located in Limuru, 28 kilometers from Nairobi. It produces between 2 and 2.5 tons of larvae a day and expects this to double once it installs a bigger drying machine.
So our waste comes in from all the big markets in Nairobi, from City Park, from Wakulima, from Marikiti. But we also get a lot of waste from industrial juice companies, so companies that make Oke juice, Kevian, all those people, we collect their waste and we bring it to our facility and then we mash it into food for the black soldier flies. Apart from that waste, we also use a lot of brewery waste. So per day we get between 20 to 30 tons of waste, which we then convert into 2.5 tons of end product.
Nairobi generates about 3,000 tons of waste daily, with 60% of it being organic material, according to the country's Ministry of Environment and Forestry. In the 10 days the black soldier fly is at larva stage, it is known to consume 60% of the waste fed to it. The chief executive of Insectipro said the larva is sold mostly to animal feed millers, with the biggest clients already asking to be supplied with 40 tons a month.
My team is really cool. My entire management were all under 25 years old, including our farm managers. And then in total, right now we have around 52 people working on BSF production and four people working on cricket production.
Well, all this is about passion. I didn't study this myself, I did education. Yeah, but now I'm in this field, mostly because of, I think it's passion. And just that fulfillment that you get working with larvae, worms. I mean, it's fascinating.
When the borders were blocked off, they stopped bringing in fish meal into the country. Fish meal is our main competitive product, so Tanzania and Uganda withheld, or it took longer to cross the border, meaning that the demand for black soldier flies went up, because black soldier flies are an alternative to fish meal. So demand went up, but we had problems on the supply side because of course a lot of factories closed down. So what we did is we tried to store as much as possible, but we did reduce our production from 2 tons a day to a little bit under 1.
While use of black soldier fly to produce animal feed has been going on in Kenya as far back as 2012. Insectipro's scale is the biggest in the country. The company said it had invested $850,000, with most of it going to machinery, which it had to design and contract local fabricators to build. Insectipro is researching how to produce chitin, which is left over in the black soldier fly shell when it changes to an adult, and has potential use in the pharmaceutical industry.
Biggest difference is that the BSF manure is the plant converts it very fast, so it's like fertilizer. It's taken up very fast. It breaks into the soil very well, and it also helps the soil maintain a very good texture.
We think Insectipro is a company of the future because we are where sustainability and profitability meet. And more importantly, we see the beauty within the beast, and I think you should too.
The company also processes waste on site at a coffee mill in Thika and a fruit farm in Machakos, and plans to set up in Kisumu and eventually open units in Ethiopia and Rwanda. The COVID-19 pandemic could almost double the number of people suffering acute hunger globally, pushing it to more than 250 million by the end of this year.
This year's report, the 2020 report, basically tells us that even before COVID-19, at the beginning of 2020, we already had very large number of people in severe acute food insecurity. Actually, the largest ever number of people in severe acute food insecurity since we had the first edition of the report in 2017.
Global Report on Food Crisis 2020 says almost 5 million people suffered acute food insecurity in northern Nigeria in 2019. Nationally, 7% of children aged 6 to 59 months suffered from wasting, which is considered a medium prevalence. Of them, 1.5% were affected by severe wasting. The wasting prevalence in the 3 crisis-affected states was high in Borno State with 10.6%, and medium in Yobe with 8.9%, while Adamawa has 7.1%. Persistent insecurity due to the 10-year-old Boko Haram insurgency is causing continuing misery and dangers for millions living in northern states. Climate change and a growing population is putting pressure on land, with growing tensions and violence between pastoralists and farmers, leading to a lack of investment and failure to maximize the country's vast agricultural potential. Levels of poverty, especially in the north, remain stubbornly high, with half the people in the country estimated to be living on less than $1.90 per day. Globally, the number of people facing acute food insecurity will rise to 265 million by the end of 2020. The impact of lost tourism revenues, falling remittances and travel and other restrictions linked to the coronavirus pandemic are expected to leave some 130 million more people acutely hungry this year, adding to around 135 million already in that category.
It is important to stress that these 135 million people who are already in situation of food crisis are already weakened. They are very fragile health, and it's clear that these people, they will be further affected by the impact, and therefore they need our continued support.
Yemen, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Afghanistan, Bolivian Republic of Venezuela, Ethiopia, South Sudan, Syria, the Sudan, Nigeria, and Haiti are the 10 countries which constituted the worst food crisis in 2019. These 10 countries accounted for 88 million people. South Sudan had 61% of its population in a state of food crisis or worse in 2019.
We are extremely worried about the displaced people, the IDPs, the refugees that are also very impacted. And then we are also very concerned by the fact that COVID-19 could create the conditions for social and political unrest in some of these contexts.
In December, the United Nations said it needed $270 million urgently to provide food to hungry South Sudanese in the first half of 2020 and avert mass starvation in South Sudan. The world's youngest country has been plagued by droughts in recent months and flooding, which have destroyed crops and livestock, leaving millions without food.
Nowhere else in the world has the level of food insecurity as South Sudan. Last year, we had to feed 5 million people due to fighting and flooding. Already in 2020, we've had locust invasions, and now there is the COVID-19 pandemic, which we predict could almost double the people in acute hunger by the end of 2020 across the world. The only way we can halt this trend is if generous funding for humanitarian crises like the one here in South Sudan continues.
Regional crises continue to see high levels of acute food insecurity, particularly in the Lake Chad Basin and Central Sahel. Africa has the largest numbers of acutely food insecure people in need of assistance in countries badly affected by weather events, particularly in the Horn of Africa and Southern Africa, followed by Central America and Pakistan. In East Africa, armed conflict, intercommunal violence, and other localized tensions continue to affect peace and security, particularly in South Sudan, and continues to maintain large refugee populations in neighboring countries such as Uganda.
WFP estimates that 20 million people are now food insecure in 9 countries in the region: Ethiopia, South Sudan, Kenya, Somalia, Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi, Djibouti, and Eritrea. We have done projection about the situation there, about the number of food insecure people. And this number is likely to increase to 34 million, up to 41 million during the next 3 months due to the socio-economic impact of COVID-19.
The report reflects the growing influence of economic crisis on acute food insecurity levels, particularly in the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, Zimbabwe, Haiti, and the Sudan. An estimated 79 million people remained displaced globally as of mid-2019. 44 million of them internally displaced and 20 million were refugees under the UNHCR's mandate. More than half of these refugees were hosted in countries with high numbers of acutely food insecure people. In countries where funding constraints have reduced assistance in refugee camps, refugees' food security was severely threatened. Civil war broke out in oil-producing South Sudan in 2013, less than 2 years after the country gained independence from Sudan following decades of war. The conflict that has killed an estimated 400,000 people and forced millions from their homes.
First, we think we need to continue, scale up, expand real-time, near real-time monitoring of the food security situation. We need to have a clear picture of what the impact of situation like COVID is so that we can trigger really early action. The second one, we need to preserve critical humanitarian food, livelihood, and nutrition assistance to vulnerable people. This is absolutely critical. Social protection is another area where we need to work. In the meantime, we need to make sure that in terms of access to food, that the food that is produced continues to flow to the market. We need to make sure that food processing continues, that transport and access to local markets is secured. And this includes advocating for trade corridors to basically remain open.
The novel coronavirus disease is having an unprecedented impact around the world, both in health and socio-economic terms. While COVID-19 does not discriminate, the 55 countries and territories that are home to 135 million acutely food insecure people in need of urgent humanitarian food and nutrition assistance are the most vulnerable to the consequences of this pandemic, as they have very limited or no capacity to cope with either the health or socio-economic aspect of the shock. These countries may face an excruciating trade-off between saving lives or livelihoods, or in a worst-case scenario, saving people from the coronavirus to have them die from hunger. Eradicating hunger and malnutrition is one of the great challenges of our time. Not only do the consequences of not enough or the wrong food cause suffering and poor health, they also slow progress in many other areas of development, like education and employment. And we've been told the time to end hunger is now. That's our program for the week. Thank you for watching. We'll see you next week.